the conversation has really been about computational thinking. Okay, that term thinking, and that's where a lot of the energy's been. And I sort of think of computational literacy as a much broader conceptualization of computational thinking. It sort of encompasses computational thinking. But so the reasons are like a literacy is something that is developmental. It involves culture, it involves ways of thinking, and it involves identity. So like these are the pieces that are really interesting for me. So I can like a quick example. You know the song Five Little Ducks Went Out to Play? Okay. Five little ducks went out to play over the hills and far away. Mama duck called quack, 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 and only four little ducks came back. And then the song repeats. The next time you go through the song, there's three ducks and two ducks and then one duck, and then like no ducks come back and the mom's really sad. And then you sing the verse one more time and then all the ducks come back. So I sing that song to little kids, like or my sons and daughters, right? And like, why am I singing that song? And this is like an example of a culturally embedded literacy activity. So from like our earliest ages, like adults and children, like really sort of cultural forms of like songs and letters and, you know, refrigerator magnet letters, like we are building literacy, reading storybooks, right? Like all of these things like are building literacy, building numeracy. If you come from a musical family, your interactions with your parents are probably very like musical in nature. Like you probably have a lot of musical memories with, I don't know about you in particular, but like that sort of music as a literacy is sort of very sort of much culturally conveyed. Like sure, schools have a part to play, but there's like literacy takes a long time to develop. It has profound implications for our identity. So we become like a literate person and like that's part of our identity. And once we have literacy, it shapes the way we think in profound ways. It shapes the kind of ideas we have. It shapes the language that we use to think about ideas. When we're thinking about computational thinking, I think we think of things like hour of code, right? It's sort of like, or like you have to have a CS graduation requirement to get out of a Chicago public high school, right? And when I think about literacy, I think about a much, much longer trajectory and direction. And so like a lot of these ideas for me are shaped by people like Andy DeSessa and Annette V are two scholars that I've been, you know, reading a lot of that have influenced my thinking there. So when I'm thinking about computation as a literacy, I think about it in those terms. Like it's not just a one and done hour of code kind of thing. It's something that happens over a long period of time. I don't think it's culturally embedded right now. And I'm really curious about like, how do we get to the like sort of the Five Little Ducks song version of computational literacy.
Full disclaimer, I'm not a huge fan of computational thinking and the way that it's presented. One, there's no unified definition of it. Nobody knows what they're talking about when they say computational thinking because everybody assumes their own other completely different definition of it. The first time that I was really introduced to the idea of computational literacies was in a paper by Kafai and Proctor. So it's called A Revaluation of Computational Thinking in K-12 Education, Moving Toward Computational Literacies. And that's episode 111. I actually unpack that in this podcast. And I really enjoyed the way that they described it in terms of it like being like a thing that you do. It's much more active. And I really appreciate your description of literacy taking a long period of time is not just a one and done. I often see a lot of districts when they engage in computational thinking in particular, they look at it and go, all right, well, I checked off that I just did pattern recognition. I won't need to do that until next semester. Right. And it's like, no, like if this is actually conceived of as a literacy or even a skill, like if I'm very slowly learning Japanese, and if I spent an hour one semester or 1 year trying to learn Japanese, would I ever be able to learn how to read, write, speak Japanese?
Right.
No, never. It's like not going to happen.
Never.
And so I really like your framing of computational literacies, but I'm curious, like, what do you wish more educators understood about your framing of computational literacies?
That's a great question. And I should also say, like, you know, I don't think that becoming computationally literate is as difficult as, say, learning Japanese, right? Like, I think that Andy DeSessa calls it like a technical literacy, which is something like maybe like algebra is like another example that he really likes to hold up as a technical literacy. It's something that once you kind of learn algebra and you can start thinking in these ways, like I think a lot of people have the experience of doing algebra and it sort of felt like, wow, that really actually changed the way I think about a lot of things. I have to say, like, I'm actually a big fan of a lot of the direction that people who are designing the high school curriculum are thinking about, or even the K-8 curriculum are really thinking about, this as a long game, as something that can be integrated meaningfully with other subjects. And I think that that's coming along slowly. But, I think that would be my kind of biggest takeaway for me. Is like, being literate means that I can engage in other kinds of things using that language as a tool, right? So for me, it becomes a tool to think about music, or it becomes a tool to think about, like for Andy DeSessa, it's a tool to think about physics, or there's a really brilliant paper by Bruce Sherens. This is an older paper, but it's kind of like, it's sort of like asking this really cool what if question, like what if we took out equations out of learning physics in the intro physics class at an undergraduate level and instead used coding? What would the implications of that be? And he really kind of takes a deep dive into that world. And it's not like a direct actionable thing, but it's just more of a shift in vantage point and like kind of how we think about the role of coding and computation in its relationship to other subjects and other ways of being. And that we don't have to like do it all. Like it's okay, we do I don't mind doing an hour of code, right? Like it's an introduction. And I don't have to like accomplish the whole field. But, I do think you're right. Like it does help address this kind of like check mark mentality that like, oh, we did this topic, so we're done, right? And that's it.
Yeah, and the framing of, you mentioned using it as a tool. A literacy involves not just reading, but also writing. So not just using, but also creating. And so that idea is a very key distinction from what I see people describing as computational thinking, where it's just like, oh, well, you're thinking about something. You might be solving a problem, but you might not be. You might not be creating things. You might not be creating or reading or doing anything. You're just thinking. But literacies might involve more than that. This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast was from episode 189, which is titled Computational Literacies with Michael Horn. You can listen to this episode as well as hundreds more by simply searching for the CSK8 podcast on your favorite podcast app.